For 6 months, an elderly black janitor quietly cleaned the halls of one of America's richest universities, while students laughed at her, professors ignored her, and wealthy parents walked past like she didn't exist. Some students even filmed themselves humiliating her for fun. But what nobody realized was that the old woman never defended herself because she was watching, listening, recording everything, every insult, every racist joke. Every moment people revealed who they truly were when they believed nobody important was looking. Then, one viral video pushed the university into an emergency board meeting. Administrators thought they were about to control a scandal. Instead, the moment the quiet janitor walked into the room wearing a black executive suit, the entire board stood up in silence. Because the woman they humiliated wasn't just a janitor. She was the most powerful person in the university. And what she exposed next destroyed careers, exposed years of racism, and forced an elite institution to put itself on trial in front of the entire country. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. The woman everyone ignored. Boston entered winter with the kind of cold that slipped through gloves, coats, and concrete walls alike. Thin snow drifted across the historic streets surrounding Harvard University, where towering gray stone buildings and glowing stained-glass windows made the campus look more like a kingdom than a school. Every morning before sunrise, luxury cars lined the front gates while students wrapped in designer scarves hurried across the courtyard, carrying coffee cups and futures already waiting for them. And before any of them entered their classrooms, one elderly woman quietly pushed a janitor's cart through the marble hallways of the law building. Her name was Evelyn Carter. At 73 years old, Evelyn moved slowly but carefully, like someone who had learned long ago that dignity did not need speed to survive. She was a black woman with deep brown skin softened by age, silver gray hair tucked neatly beneath a dark headscarf, and tired hands marked by years of chemicals, winter air, and hard labor. Her back curved slightly when she walked, but there was something strangely steady about her posture, something calm in the way she looked at people without lowering her eyes. Most students never noticed that part. To them, she was simply the old janitor, invisible. Evelyn wore the same faded gray uniform every day, and soft black shoes with worn soles that barely made noise against the polished floors. She spoke gently to everyone, even the people who ignored her. Every morning at exactly 5:30, she cleaned the hallway outside Professor Coleman's lecture room before moving toward the main staircase near the political science department. She had memorized the rhythm of the building, which professors arrived early, which students avoided eye contact, which ones laughed the loudest when nobody important was watching. That morning, a group of wealthy students stepped out of the law building cafe carrying breakfast trays and expensive winter coats. At the center of the group was Tyler Monroe, a tall white student with neatly styled blonde hair, sharp blue eyes, and the easy confidence of someone born into money. Tyler came from an old banking family in Connecticut, and at Harvard he behaved like the campus belonged to him personally. Behind him walked his friends, laughing loudly, barely paying attention to anyone outside their circle. Evelyn had just finished mopping the entrance hallway when Tyler deliberately stopped in front of the wet floor sign. He smirked. "Oh no," he said loudly. "Looks dangerous." The group laughed. Then one of the boys casually dropped part of his muffin onto the clean floor. Another tossed napkins beside it. Tyler looked directly at Evelyn before tipping the remains of his coffee onto the marble tiles. Brown liquid spread slowly across the floor she had spent 20 minutes cleaning. Someone nearby pulled out a phone. The recording started. Evelyn looked down at the mess for only a second. Then she quietly bent her knees and began wiping it away. The boys laughed harder. "This is probably the highlight of her day," one of them muttered. Students passing through the hallway glanced over briefly before continuing toward class. Nobody stopped. Nobody said anything. Evelyn simply cleaned the floor in silence while the camera kept recording. At the opposite end of campus, Naomi Reed stood outside the political science building clutching 2 heavy textbooks against her chest. Naomi was 19 years old, a first-year political science student from Southside Chicago. She was tall and slender, with smooth, dark brown skin, expressive brown eyes, and tightly curled black hair usually tied into a low puff behind her head. There was intelligence in her face, but also caution, the kind that came from growing up learning how quickly confidence could be mistaken for arrogance when you looked like her. She had earned her place at Harbridge through scholarships, academic competitions, and sleepless nights spent studying while helping her mother care for her younger brothers back home. But during her first 3 months at the university, she had started noticing something difficult to explain. Harbridge celebrated diversity in brochures, not always in real life. Inside her Introduction to Political Theory class, Naomi sat near the front while students gathered into discussion groups around her. Nobody invited her over. A blonde student briefly glanced in her direction before turning away and joining another table. Naomi quietly opened her notebook alone. Professor Richard Coleman entered moments later. Coleman was one of Harbridge's most respected professors, at least publicly. A white man in his late 50s, he carried himself with polished authority, silver hair perfectly combed, thin glasses resting on a narrow face that rarely showed warmth. Students admired him because powerful politicians often quoted his work on television. But Naomi had already learned something else about him. He liked reminding certain students they were outsiders. Halfway through class, Coleman asked a question about constitutional reform. Naomi raised her hand carefully. Coleman looked directly at her, then looked past her. He called on another student instead. 20 minutes later, Naomi tried again. This time, Coleman sighed before nodding impatiently. "Yes, Miss Reed?" Naomi answered clearly, intelligently, and with more detail than most students in the room. Before she could finish, Coleman interrupted her. "Well," he said lightly, "that's certainly an ambitious interpretation." A few students laughed quietly. Coleman smiled thinly. "Harbridge encourages everyone to speak confidently. That doesn't always mean they understand the material." More laughter. Naomi's face remained still, but inside embarrassment spread like heat through her chest. She lowered her hand and stopped speaking for the rest of class. Outside the lecture hall, snowflakes drifted through the gray afternoon sky as students hurried past discussing internships, networking dinners, and holiday trips to Europe. Naomi walked alone toward the library. She tried convincing herself she was imagining things. Maybe people were just busy. Maybe she was too sensitive. Maybe— "Miss Reed." The voice stopped her near the library entrance. An older black man stood beside the stone steps holding a stack of papers beneath one arm. Professor Arthur Bennett taught legal history at Harbridge. He was nearing 70, tall and lean, with dark skin faded slightly by age, calm eyes behind round glasses, and a quiet voice students often underestimated. Unlike most professors, Bennett never raised his voice to command respect. He had spent 40 years inside elite institutions learning exactly how silence could hide cruelty. "I read your midterm essay," he said gently. Naomi blinked in surprise. "You did?" "It was excellent." For the first time all day, Naomi smiled slightly. "Thank you, Professor." Bennett studied her expression for a moment. Then his face became more serious. "Harbridge is an old institution," he said quietly. "Old institutions become very skilled at hiding ugly things behind beautiful traditions." Naomi looked confused. Professor Bennett lowered his voice further. "Be careful not to mistake politeness for acceptance here." Snow drifted between them. Then he added softly, "Harbridge only looks equal from the outside." The words stayed with Naomi long after he walked away. That evening, the campus library remained crowded long after sunset. Naomi sat alone near the back corner, entering data for her work-study shift. Her scholarship covered most of her tuition, but not enough to survive Boston's cost of living completely. So, every night after class, she worked 4 hours reorganizing archives and assisting students in the library database office. By 10:45 p.m., her eyes burned from exhaustion. She rubbed them briefly before carrying a stack of returned books toward the lower reading level. That was when she noticed Evelyn. The old janitor slowly pushed her cart between empty study tables, replacing trash bags and wiping fingerprints from wooden surfaces. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Evelyn offered a small smile. "You should go home before the snow gets worse." Her voice was soft and warm. Naomi smiled politely back. "I still have another hour." Evelyn nodded knowingly, as if she'd understood exactly what that meant. As Naomi walked away, Evelyn quietly watched her disappear behind the shelves. There was sadness in Evelyn's eyes. Not pity, recognition. Near midnight, the library finally emptied. Naomi returned to her usual study table near the far window and placed her books down. Then she froze. Across the center of the wooden table, written in thick red marker, were 5 large words. "You don't belong here." The room suddenly felt colder. Naomi stared at the message silently while distant wind rattled against the library windows. For several seconds she didn't move. Then, slowly she removed a cleaning wipe from her backpack. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrubbed the words away before anyone else could see. Red ink smeared across the wood. Her eyes watered, but she forced herself not to cry. And from the far end of the empty library hallway, Evelyn Carter stood completely still beside her janitor's cart, quietly watching Naomi erase the words alone, without saying a single word. The video that shook the campus. Boston woke beneath a sky the color of cold steel. Snow from the previous night had hardened into thin layers of ice along the sidewalks surrounding Harvard University, while students hurried between buildings wrapped in wool coats and expensive scarves, more focused on finals and internships than the quiet tension beginning to spread across campus. At 7:12 that morning, a 30-second video appeared on Harbridge Hub, the private student social platform connected to TikTok and Reddit threads used by nearly every student at the university. Within an hour, thousands of people had watched it. By noon, the entire campus had seen it. The video opened with laughter. Tyler Monroe stood in the center of the law building hallway holding a tray of cafeteria food while his friends crowded behind him with phones raised. The camera shook slightly as someone zoomed in on Evelyn Carter mopping the marble floor beneath the staircase. "Careful," Tyler joked loudly. "She's protecting Harvard-level flooring here." The boys laughed. Then Tyler intentionally tipped the tray forward. Mashed potatoes, soda, fries, and ketchup splashed across the clean floor directly in front of Evelyn. One student nearly choked, laughing. Another voice behind the camera said, "This is probably the only thing she's good at." The video captured Evelyn pausing for one brief second before quietly kneeling to clean the mess while the hallway echoed with laughter. Then the recording ended. No dramatic music, no edits, just humiliation. And somehow, that made it worse. Inside the political science building, students whispered about the video before class even started. Some laughed while replaying it. Others avoided talking about it altogether. Naomi Reed sat silently near the back row, gripping her notebook tighter every time she heard Evelyn's name mentioned. She had barely slept the night before. The image of those red words on the library table still replayed in her mind every few minutes. "You don't belong here." She kept telling herself to ignore it. But now the video had made something painfully clear. Harbridge did not merely tolerate cruelty, it normalized it. As students settled into their seats, Professor Richard Coleman entered the lecture hall carrying his usual leather briefcase beneath one arm. His expression remained polished and composed as always, though there was a faint irritation in the way he adjusted his glasses. Coleman hated controversy when it threatened the university's reputation. Without acknowledging the tension in the room, he began his lecture immediately. Halfway through class, he called on a white male student who gave a weak answer regarding voting behavior statistics. Coleman nodded approvingly anyway. Moments later, Naomi carefully raised her hand. Coleman looked at her for a second longer than necessary. "Yes, Miss Reed." Naomi answered clearly, explaining how economic disenfranchisement often influenced political participation more than party affiliation alone. A few students turned toward her, surprised by the confidence in her voice. Coleman smiled faintly. "Well," he said slowly, "Harbridge certainly values creating opportunities for diverse perspectives." The room became quiet. Naomi felt her stomach tighten. Coleman continued casually, pretending innocence, though sometimes enthusiasm arrives before experience. A few students laughed softly. One girl near the front smirked while typing something into her phone. Naomi lowered her eyes toward her notebook again. She understood exactly what Coleman meant. Diversity quota. The phrase was never spoken directly. It didn't have to be. After class, Naomi walked quickly toward the student cafe, hoping to avoid attention. But as she passed a table near the windows, she overheard two students talking. "I mean, he's not wrong," one boy whispered. "Schools lower standards all the time now." The other shrugged. She probably got in because they needed representation. Naomi kept walking. Outside, cold wind struck her face sharply enough to sting her eyes. Across campus, Tyler Monroe sat in the middle of the student union, scrolling through notifications exploding beneath the video. He looked proud of himself. Every few seconds, another repost appeared. Thousands of views, hundreds of comments. But sitting beside him was a freshman named Ethan Brooks, the student who had originally recorded the video. Ethan was younger than the others, only 18, with pale skin, messy brown hair, and nervous blue eyes that constantly shifted when conversations became uncomfortable. Unlike Tyler, Ethan did not come from wealth. He attended Harbridge through an athletic scholarship after growing up in a struggling family in rural Vermont. Ever since arriving at the university, he had tried desperately to fit into circles more powerful than him. That desperation was why he recorded the video. But now, watching strangers online laugh at an old woman being humiliated, something inside him felt wrong. "You think administration's going to say something?" Ethan asked quietly. Tyler scoffed. "They're janitors. Nobody cares." The others laughed again. Ethan forced a smile, but it didn't reach his face. Later that evening, while most students crowded restaurants and dorm parties, Evelyn Carter quietly cleaned the empty upper hallway of the administrative building. The silence there felt different from the rest of campus. Older. Heavier. She moved slowly between offices, carrying her cleaning supplies while snow tapped softly against the dark windows outside. Then she stopped beside a small maintenance closet and removed a black notebook from inside her janitor cart. Unlike her calm expression, the notebook itself was brutally organized. Dates, names, locations, comments overheard, incidents witnessed, student complaints ignored, professor behavior. Patterns. Every page contained evidence. Evelyn adjusted her glasses slightly before writing another entry in careful handwriting. Video incident. Public humiliation normalized. Administrative silence continues. She paused briefly. Then, beneath it, she added, "Naomi Reed targeted again in Coleman lecture." The hallway lights reflected softly against her tired eyes as she closed the notebook. For the first time all day, sadness crossed her face openly, not because she was surprised, because she had seen this before, years ago. Different buildings, different people, same cruelty. Downstairs, near the journalism department, another person had also become interested in the viral video. Daniel Ross leaned back in his chair watching the clip replay on his laptop screen for the fourth time. Daniel was a 34-year-old local investigative reporter for the Boston Ledger. Tall, lean, and constantly exhausted-looking, he had dark hair beginning to gray near the temples and sharp, observant eyes shaped by years chasing political scandals no one powerful wanted exposed. He had built a reputation for digging into stories institutions preferred burying quietly. And something about this video bothered him. Not merely the cruelty, the silence afterward. Harbridge University usually reacted immediately to anything threatening its image. But this time, nothing. No statement, no apology, no disciplinary action. Daniel opened another browser tab and began reading older student forum posts connected to discrimination complaints at Harbridge. His expression slowly hardened. There were more incidents than he expected. Far more. That same night, Naomi worked her late library shift beneath dim yellow lights while students whispered around study tables preparing for exams. Her body felt exhausted, but going home meant thinking too much. So she stayed busy. Near closing time, she carried returned books toward the archive shelves downstairs when she noticed Evelyn cleaning fingerprints from a glass door nearby. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Naomi quietly asked, "Are you okay?" Evelyn looked up. There was no anger in her expression, only calm. "I've survived worse than college boys trying to impress each other," she replied softly. Naomi attempted a small smile, but Evelyn noticed the sadness still sitting behind her eyes. "You should not let people decide your value for you," Evelyn said gently. Naomi hesitated. "That's easy to say." Evelyn studied her for a moment before answering. "No," she said quietly. "It isn't." Something about the way she said it made Naomi pause, like those words came from experience too painful to explain casually. Before Naomi could respond, footsteps echoed through the library entrance upstairs. 3 students entered laughing loudly. One of them recognized Naomi immediately. "Hey," he called mockingly. "Careful. Don't say the wrong thing around here. Somebody might accuse you of racism." The others laughed. Naomi looked away silently. Evelyn's expression never changed, but her fingers tightened slightly around the cleaning cloth in her hand. The students eventually walked off toward another section of the library. Naomi exhaled shakily. "I don't know how you stay calm," she admitted quietly. Evelyn looked toward the dark library windows where snow continued falling outside. "Because angry people often want you to become angry too," she said. "It helps them sleep better afterward." Then she returned to cleaning. Near midnight, while the campus slowly quieted beneath fresh snowfall, computers inside the Harbridge Administrative Network suddenly received a new email. Recipients included the university president, the vice board chair, 3 senior administrators, and every member of the Harbridge Board of Trustees. No sender name appeared, only an anonymous address. Attached beneath the message were dozens of documents: student complaints, screenshots, archived reports, emails, records of discrimination accusations buried quietly over multiple years. At the top of the message, one sentence appeared in bold: "How many students needed to suffer before Harbridge decided silence was easier than justice?" And deep inside the nearly empty library, Evelyn Carter slowly closed her black notebook while snow continued falling outside the windows. The professor who went too far. Snow continued falling over Boston through the weekend, covering the old streets around Harbridge University in heavy white silence. By Monday morning, the campus looked almost beautiful again. Students walked across the icy courtyards carrying coffee cups and backpacks, while sunlight reflected softly against the stone buildings. From the outside, Harbridge still appeared calm, prestigious, untouchable. But beneath that polished surface, tension had started spreading quietly through the university like a crack beneath frozen glass. The viral janitor video had not disappeared. It had only grown. Students whispered about it in elevators, dorm rooms, and lecture halls. Anonymous accounts reposted it daily. Some defended Tyler Monroe and called the backlash overreaction. Others questioned why the university administration still had not released a single statement. And somewhere inside all that noise, Naomi Reed was slowly beginning to disappear into herself. That morning, she sat near the center of Richard Coleman's lecture hall, staring blankly at the open notebook in front of her. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes from another sleepless night. She had spent most of Sunday calculating tuition payments, library work hours, and how much money remained in her bank account after winter housing deductions. Not enough. Her scholarship covered tuition only if she maintained exceptional academic performance. One failed semester could destroy everything she had worked for. Around her, students chatted casually while waiting for class to begin. Naomi noticed how conversations lowered slightly whenever she walked near certain groups now. Some students recognized her from the library incident rumors spreading quietly online. Others simply associated her with controversy. At exactly 9 a.m., Professor Richard Coleman entered the room. Coleman wore a charcoal gray suit beneath his wool overcoat, carrying himself with the same polished authority he always displayed. But today there was something sharper in his expression. Irritation. The growing public attention surrounding Harbridge clearly bothered him. He placed his briefcase down and began lecturing immediately about institutional power structures in American politics. Halfway through class, Coleman projected a graph comparing admissions statistics across elite universities. Then his tone changed. Modern institutions, he said calmly, often struggle balancing merit and social pressure. Several students looked up with interest. Coleman slowly walked across the front of the room. Many universities now prioritize image alongside academic excellence, sometimes more than excellence. A few students smirked quietly. Naomi felt her stomach tighten immediately. Coleman continued. Brochures matter, public perception matters, diversity photographs matter. Some laughter spread across the room. Then Coleman glanced directly toward Naomi and smiled. After all, he said lightly, some students are accepted to make brochures look diverse. The room exploded with laughter. Not everyone, but enough for Naomi to feel every sound hit her like physical pressure. Her face burned instantly. She lowered her eyes toward the desk, forcing herself not to react while students exchanged awkward looks around her. Someone behind her whispered, "Damn." Another student quietly laughed into his sleeve. Coleman pretended nothing unusual had happened and returned to the lecture as if he had merely made an ordinary academic observation. Naomi blinked rapidly, trying to keep tears from forming. She would not cry here, not in front of them. Outside the lecture hall, Evelyn Carter slowly pushed her cleaning cart down the corridor, replacing trash liners beside classroom doors. The hallway was mostly empty except for distant echoes from nearby lectures. Then Coleman's voice carried through the slightly open classroom door. Accepted to make brochures look diverse. The laughter followed seconds later. Evelyn stopped walking. Her hands remained resting lightly on the janitor cart handle while the sound echoed into the hallway. For several moments, she did not move at all. Then, slowly, something in her expression changed. Until now, Evelyn had watched everything with sadness, patience, restraint. But hearing Naomi publicly humiliated while an entire classroom laughed awakened something colder behind her eyes, not rage, disappointment, the kind built over decades. A young student exiting a nearby classroom accidentally brushed past Evelyn and immediately apologized. Evelyn nodded politely, but her attention remained fixed on the lecture hall door. Inside, Naomi sat frozen while Coleman continued speaking, and outside, for the first time since arriving at Harbridge as a janitor, Evelyn Carter looked less like an elderly cleaning woman and more like someone quietly measuring the weight of every person inside that room. Later that afternoon, Naomi skipped lunch entirely and locked herself inside a library study booth. She replayed Coleman's words over and over until they no longer sounded shocking, only familiar. Her phone buzzed twice with unread messages from her mother in Chicago asking how school was going. Naomi didn't answer. Instead, she opened her tuition portal. A red notification flashed across the screen. Outstanding balance due in 5 days. Naomi stared at it silently. Then she finally allowed herself to cry. Quietly. Carefully. The kind of crying designed not to make sound. Meanwhile, across campus, another student could not stop thinking about what happened in Coleman's class either. Lucas Miller sat alone inside the student cafe, staring down at his untouched coffee while conversations buzzed around him. Lucas was a 20-year-old white economics student with dark blonde hair, broad shoulders, and thoughtful green eyes that often made him appear older than he actually was. Unlike Tyler Monroe and the other wealthy students, Lucas came from a middle-class family in Ohio. His father had worked factory jobs most of his life before losing employment during an economic collapse years earlier. Growing up watching his family struggle had left Lucas deeply uncomfortable around cruelty disguised as superiority. But Harbridge had changed him more than he liked admitting. For months, he had stayed quiet to fit in, laughed at jokes he disliked, ignored behavior he knew was wrong. Today felt different. He had been sitting 3 rows behind Naomi during Coleman's comment, and for the first time, he hated himself for saying nothing. Across the cafe television screens, news stations briefly mentioned growing criticism toward Harbridge University regarding the viral janitor video. Tyler Monroe and several other students laughed dismissively from another table nearby. "It'll disappear in a week," Tyler said confidently. Lucas didn't respond. Instead, he quietly opened his phone and replayed a short clip he had secretly recorded during Coleman's lecture earlier that morning. The audio was clear. Some students are accepted to make brochures look diverse. Lucas stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he copied the file into a private email draft. That evening, Daniel Ross sat inside the cramped office of the Boston Ledger, surrounded by stacks of documents and half-finished coffee cups. Rain tapped lightly against the windows while city traffic blurred outside beneath yellow streetlights. Daniel had spent 2 days investigating Harbridge's buried discrimination complaints. Most former students refused interviews. Too afraid. Too exhausted. Too convinced nothing would change. Then, a new anonymous email appeared in his inbox. Attached was a short classroom video. Daniel pressed play. Seconds later, his jaw tightened. "Jesus Christ," he muttered quietly. The footage ended with laughter filling the room. Daniel immediately leaned forward and began taking notes. Back on campus, Naomi returned to her dorm after midnight, carrying library books against her chest. Her roommate was away for the weekend, leaving the small room painfully quiet. Naomi sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the scholarship warning email still open on her laptop screen. Outstanding balance due. 5 days. She slowly closed the computer. For the first time since arriving at Harbridge, she seriously considered leaving. Maybe Coleman was right. Maybe people like her were never truly wanted there. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Naomi quickly wiped her eyes before opening the door. No one stood outside, only a small campus envelope resting on the floor. Confused, she picked it up. Inside was a printed financial notice from the university bursar office. Account balance updated. Naomi frowned. Then her eyes widened. The overdue tuition balance had disappeared completely. Below the payment confirmation was one line: funding assistance provided through Carter Educational Trust. Naomi stared at the paper silently. She had never heard of the organization before. Downstairs, through the dormitory lobby window, an elderly woman in a gray janitor uniform quietly pushed her cleaning cart through the falling snow outside before disappearing into the darkness of campus. The secret, inside, Harbridge, Boston's winter storms grew heavier by the second week of December. Ice clung to the iron gates of Harbridge University while television vans began parking outside campus entrances before sunrise. Reporters stood beneath umbrellas speaking into cameras as students walked past, pretending not to notice them. For decades, Harbridge had controlled its public image with almost surgical precision. But now, something was slipping beyond its control, and the deeper Daniel Ross investigated, the uglier the university began to look. Inside the cramped newsroom of the Boston Ledger, Daniel sat surrounded by open folders, legal pads, and dozens of printed testimonies from former Harbridge students. Most of them were black students, some Latino, a few Asian students who described years of quiet humiliation buried beneath polished language and institutional silence. One testimony described a black student repeatedly denied research opportunities despite having the highest grades in her department. Another mentioned racist vandalism ignored by campus security. A third described a professor telling a student, "You should be grateful to even be here." Daniel leaned back slowly, rubbing his tired eyes. He had spent 15 years exposing corruption in Boston politics, but this felt different. Harbridge was not a careless institution. It was old money, old power, the kind of power that survived by making victims doubt themselves before they ever spoke publicly. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Rachel Kim stepped into the office carrying another stack of files. Rachel was a Korean-American data researcher in her late 20s with sharp features, shoulder-length black hair, and an analytical personality that made her excellent at uncovering patterns others missed. She rarely showed emotion openly, but Daniel trusted her instincts more than almost anyone. "You need to see this," she said quietly. She handed him a spreadsheet. Daniel scanned it. Student withdrawal records. Over the past 10 years, black students at Harbridge had dropped out at nearly double the rate of white students receiving similar financial aid. Daniel frowned. "That's not public." "It wasn't supposed to be," Rachel replied. Daniel looked up slowly. "Where did you get this?" Rachel hesitated. "Anonymous source." Daniel said nothing for several seconds. Then he quietly asked, "The same source sending the complaints?" Rachel nodded once. Outside the office windows, snow continued falling over Boston while Daniel stared down at the documents in silence. This was no longer just about one viral video. Something systemic was buried inside Harbridge. Across the city, the humiliation video involving Evelyn Carter had now spread far beyond student platforms. Local television stations replayed the clip repeatedly beneath headlines questioning racial culture at elite universities. Online commentators argued across social media while former students began anonymously sharing stories of discrimination at Harbridge using fake accounts. The university administration still refused to comment. That silence only made the backlash worse. Inside the main dining hall at Harbridge, students crowded around phones discussing the growing scandal, while Tyler Monroe sat visibly irritated near the center table. "This is insane," Tyler snapped. "People are acting like we committed a crime." One of his friends laughed nervously. "It's just internet outrage. Give it a week." But another chair at the table remained empty. Lucas Miller no longer sat with them. Instead, Lucas stood near the far end of the cafeteria speaking quietly with Naomi Reed beside the vending machines. Students passing nearby glanced toward them curiously. Naomi looked uncomfortable. Lucas looked terrified. "I owe you an apology," he admitted quietly. Lucas had barely slept in 2 nights. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes, and the tension in his jaw made him appear older than usual. Since sending the classroom video to the press anonymously, he had begun noticing how easily Harbridge punished people who stepped outside the social hierarchy. Tyler and the others had stopped texting him. Students who once greeted him warmly now avoided eye contact. One fraternity invitation had suddenly been withdrawn without explanation. Naomi crossed her arms slightly. For what? Lucas swallowed hard. For staying quiet. The noise of the cafeteria faded around them for a moment. Lucas looked genuinely ashamed. "I laughed at things I shouldn't have laughed at," he continued. "I kept pretending stuff wasn't happening because it was easier." Naomi studied him carefully. Part of her wanted to stay angry. Another part looked at Lucas and saw someone struggling with guilt for the first time in his life. "That doesn't make it okay," she said softly. "I know." Lucas lowered his eyes. "But I'm trying to stop being part of it." Before Naomi could answer, Tyler Monroe suddenly appeared nearby with 2 other students behind him. "Well," Tyler said coldly, "guess we know who switched teams." Lucas stiffened immediately. Tyler's expression carried none of the easy humor he usually showed publicly. Humiliation had made him meaner. "You really going to ruin your reputation over this?" Tyler asked. Lucas met his stare. Maybe the reputation deserved ruining. For a second, nobody spoke. Then Tyler laughed sharply. Good luck surviving Harbridge without friends. Tyler walked away, but the message lingered behind, like smoke. Lucas exhaled slowly after they left. Naomi noticed his hands trembling slightly. For the first time, she realized standing against cruelty also came with consequences for people like him, too. Elsewhere on campus, Evelyn Carter quietly continued her work as if nothing around her had changed. Every morning, she pushed the same cleaning cart through the same hallways. She still smiled politely at professors, still replaced trash bags, still wiped fingerprints from glass doors while television reporters crowded outside university gates. But now, students occasionally recognized her from the viral video. Some looked embarrassed when passing her. Others avoided her completely. A few quietly thanked her for her work. Evelyn responded to all of them with the same calm expression. One snowy afternoon, while cleaning outside the administrative offices, Evelyn passed a middle-aged man exiting a board meeting. His name was Harold Whitaker, a senior member of Harbridge's Board of Trustees. Harold was a heavy-set white businessman in his 60s with thinning silver hair and expensive tailored coats that smelled faintly of cigar smoke. Unlike most board members, Harold had been involved with Harbridge long enough to remember parts of its older history. As he passed Evelyn, he slowed slightly. Then, almost instinctively, he lowered his voice and said, "Good afternoon, Mrs. Carter." Evelyn paused only briefly. "Good afternoon, Harold." The exchange lasted less than 3 seconds. A young administrative assistant nearby glanced up momentarily but returned to her paperwork without thinking twice. Neither realized Daniel Ross would later become obsessed with that exact name. That evening, Daniel visited the Boston Historical Archive searching for financial records connected to Harbridge University. Dust-covered documents filled the underground records room while old fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. An elderly archivist named Martha Green assisted him reluctantly. Martha was nearly 80 years old, thin as paper, with deeply wrinkled skin and narrow spectacles balanced permanently near the tip of her nose. She had spent 40 years organizing university donations and estate histories throughout Boston. "You reporters only come down here when rich people panic," she muttered while unlocking an old cabinet. Daniel smiled faintly. "Then I guess business is booming." Martha slid several files across the table. Daniel opened the first folder. Carter Foundation. His expression sharpened instantly. For over 30 years, the Carter family had quietly funded massive portions of Harbridge University. Scholarships, building expansions, research grants, financial bailouts during recession years. Millions upon millions of dollars. Yet public references to the family remained strangely minimal. Daniel flipped through more documents rapidly. Then he stopped. A photograph had slipped loose from one of the folders. It was old, slightly faded at the corners. In the picture stood Harbridge's founder during a university expansion ceremony nearly 30 years earlier. Beside him stood a younger black woman in an elegant dark suit. Calm eyes, dignified posture, silver beginning to touch her hair. Daniel froze. Even decades younger, he recognized her instantly. Evelyn Carter, the janitor, standing beside the founder of Harbridge University like she belonged there. Because somehow, she clearly did. Daniel slowly lifted the photograph closer beneath the archive light while snow continued falling outside the underground windows of Boston. And for the first time since starting the investigation, he realized Harbridge was hiding something far bigger than a racism scandal. The boardroom reveal. Boston awoke beneath a freezing rain the morning Harbridge University finally began to panic. News vans lined the streets outside campus before sunrise, while reporters stood beneath umbrellas reporting live updates about the growing scandal surrounding the university. By now, the viral janitor video had spread far beyond Massachusetts. National commentators debated it on television. Former students posted anonymous testimonies online every hour. Hashtags connected to Harbridge trended across social media throughout the night. And inside the university administration building, fear had quietly replaced arrogance. At 8, 0 a.m. sharp, Harbridge President Daniel Whitmore entered the executive conference room carrying a leather folder beneath one arm. Whitmore was a tall white man in his early 60s with silver hair, polished manners, and the carefully controlled confidence of someone who had spent decades protecting elite institutions from public embarrassment. He believed deeply in reputation, appearances, and quiet damage control. More importantly, he believed scandals could always be managed if wealthy people remained calm enough. But this scandal refused to calm down. The emergency board meeting had been called after 3 major donors privately threatened to suspend funding unless Harbridge addressed the controversy publicly. Alumni networks were turning hostile. Reporters kept uncovering old discrimination complaints. Even faculty members had started whispering concerns behind closed doors. Whitmore hated losing control. As board members slowly entered the room, tension settled over the long mahogany table like smoke. Expensive suits, controlled voices, nervous eyes. Harold Whitaker sat near the far end, adjusting his tie repeatedly while scrolling through negative headlines on his phone. 2 trustees argued quietly about legal exposure. Another board member suggested suspending a few students publicly to contain optics. Nobody used words like racism directly. They spoke in corporate language instead. Reputation management. Public pressure. Institutional response. Whitmore finally stood near the head of the table and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began calmly, "the situation is unfortunate but manageable. We will release a formal statement condemning student misconduct, announce a campus review committee, and cooperate with media inquiries temporarily." One trustee frowned. "You think that's enough?" Whitmore forced a reassuring smile. "These stories burn hot and disappear quickly. What matters is controlling the narrative before outside pressure escalates further." Outside the conference room, snow mixed with rain against the dark windows, while security guards prevented reporters from entering the administrative wing downstairs. And several floors below that meeting, Evelyn Carter quietly stood inside a private restroom looking at herself in the mirror. For the first time in 6 months, she was not wearing her janitor uniform. Instead, she wore an elegant black suit tailored perfectly despite her age, with silver jewelry resting subtly against her dark skin. Her silver-gray hair had been carefully styled back away from her face, revealing the calm authority she had hidden beneath headscarves and cleaning supplies for months. The transformation was shocking, not because she looked wealthy, because she looked powerful. Evelyn adjusted the sleeve of her jacket slowly. Her expression remained calm, but behind her eyes lived decades of memories most people inside Harbridge knew nothing about. The insults, the silence, the students who disappeared quietly after losing faith in themselves. The administrators who smiled publicly while burying complaints privately. She had watched all of it. Long enough. Outside the building entrance, Lucas Miller stood beneath the freezing rain, gripping his phone tightly. He had heard rumors about the emergency board meeting spreading through campus overnight, and something told him today mattered. Around him, students crowded near barricades trying to glimpse reporters entering the administration building. Naomi Reed stood several feet away in silence. She looked exhausted from weeks of emotional pressure, but something about today felt different even to her. Students whispered nervously, while faculty members avoided questions entirely. Then the main elevator doors upstairs opened. Inside the boardroom, Whitmore continued outlining media strategies when the conference room doors suddenly unlocked behind him. The room turned instinctively, and silence fell immediately. Evelyn Carter walked into the room. No janitor cart, no gray uniform, no lowered posture. Only the elegant black woman in the black suit walking calmly across the polished floor with absolute confidence. For one stunned second, nobody moved. Then, suddenly, every board member stood up. All at once. Chairs scraped backward across the floor as conversations died instantly. Harold Whitaker rose so quickly he nearly knocked over his glass of water. 2 trustees lowered their eyes immediately. Whitmore himself froze mid-sentence. His face lost color. because in that moment he understood something terrifying. Everyone else in the room already knew exactly who Evelyn Carter was, and he had spent 6 months allowing the most powerful woman connected to Harvard University to be humiliated publicly. "Mrs. Carter," Harold Whitaker said quietly. Evelyn gave a small nod before walking slowly toward the center of the room. Whitmore stared at her in disbelief. "You," he whispered weakly. Evelyn looked directly at him. "Yes," she replied calmly. The room remained completely silent. Outside the administration building, Lucas noticed movement through one of the upper conference room windows. Curious students nearby began pointing upward. Without fully understanding why, Lucas opened his live stream app and zoomed in toward the boardroom glass. The image was blurry from rainwater, but people online immediately noticed something strange. Every board member inside the room was standing. For the janitor, comments exploded instantly. "Wait, what? Who is she? Why are they standing?" Inside the conference room, Evelyn finally placed a black leather folder onto the table. Whitmore swallowed visibly. "I don't understand," he managed quietly. Harold Whitaker looked almost horrified by the question. Evelyn answered anyway. "I am Evelyn Carter," she said, "chairwoman of the Carter Foundation." The room stayed silent. Whitmore's breathing visibly changed. Evelyn continued calmly. "My family has funded Harvard University for 32 years. The law building renovation, the North Campus expansion, the scholarship endowment, the emergency stabilization fund during the recession." Each sentence struck harder than the last. Then she looked directly at Whitmore again. "And currently," she added softly, "I remain the largest shareholder connected to this institution." Outside, Lucas's live stream exploded across social media within minutes. Students crowded around phones, screaming in disbelief. Reporters downstairs suddenly began receiving alerts simultaneously. "The janitor owns the university. No way. This has to be fake." Inside the boardroom, nobody spoke. Whitmore looked physically shaken now. All the confidence that once defined him had disappeared completely. Evelyn slowly removed a pair of glasses from her purse and placed them on carefully. Then she finally spoke the sentence that would spread across the entire country within hours. "I cleaned these hallways for 6 months," she said quietly, "and the ugliest thing I found was never on the floor." Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed loudly. The words hit the room harder than shouting ever could. Several board members lowered their eyes in shame. Others simply looked terrified. Far below the conference room, Naomi stood frozen among students watching Lucas's live stream on someone's phone screen. Her heart pounded painfully. The elegant woman standing inside that boardroom, the woman every billionaire trustee had immediately stood for, was Evelyn, the quiet janitor who had comforted her in the library, the woman who had paid her tuition, the woman who watched silently while everyone else looked away. Naomi felt tears burn her eyes instantly, not from sadness, from realization. Everything suddenly made sense. Back inside the conference room, Evelyn slowly opened the black leather folder she brought with her. Then another, and another. Hundreds of pages, documents, complaints, emails, internal reports, witness testimonies, photographs, names, dates, evidence collected quietly over 6 months. The sound of paper spreading across the mahogany table echoed through the silent room like a verdict being delivered. Whitmore stared down at the files with visible fear now, and Evelyn Carter calmly prepared to force Harvard University to confront the truth it had buried for decades. The school couldn't hide anymore. By the next morning, Harvard University no longer belonged to itself. The story had escaped. Every major Boston news station opened with the same footage. The moment the elderly black janitor walked into the Harvard boardroom, and every trustee stood up in silence. National media replayed the clip beside headlines questioning racism inside elite American universities. Social media exploded with reactions from millions of strangers arguing, defending, condemning, and demanding answers. But what truly destroyed Harbridge was not the reveal itself. It was the evidence that followed. At 6 a.m., Daniel Ross published the first investigative article in a 3-part expose titled "The Secret Inside Harbridge." Within hours, the article spread across the country. Screenshots of internal emails flooded the internet. Confidential reports showed administrators dismissing racial complaints to avoid reputational damage. Lists of professors accused repeatedly of discriminatory behavior began circulating online. Anonymous testimonies from former students appeared faster than Harbridge could suppress them. One email written by a department chair read, "Recommend no formal response unless media attention escalates." Another said, "Student appears emotionally unstable. Complaint unlikely to become public." People were horrified, and Boston became furious. Outside Harbridge's gates, protesters gathered in growing crowds despite freezing temperatures. Students held signs demanding accountability while reporters shouted questions at administrators entering buildings through side doors. The university that once symbolized prestige now looked like a fortress under siege. Inside the administration building, Daniel Whitmore sat motionless in his office staring at the morning news coverage playing across 3 television screens simultaneously. He looked older overnight. Dark shadows rested beneath his eyes, and his hands shook slightly each time his phone vibrated with another donor threatening to withdraw support. Every headline felt like a public execution. Harbridge racism scandal grows. Internal documents expose decades of discrimination. Janitor revealed as university power holder. Whitmore muted the televisions, but silence felt worse. A knock came at his office door. Claire Donovan entered, carefully carrying a folder of resignation notices. Claire was Harbridge's communications director, a sharply dressed woman in her early 40s with auburn hair and a permanently tense posture shaped by years managing institutional crises. Normally composed under pressure, she now looked exhausted. "We have another problem," she said quietly. Whitmore closed his eyes briefly. "How many this time?" 3 department administrators resigned overnight. She placed the folder down. "And Richard Coleman's suspension paperwork is ready." Whitmore looked up sharply. "He's denying everything." "He can deny it somewhere else," Claire replied coldly. "The board voted unanimously." Whitmore leaned back heavily in his chair. For the first time in decades, Harbridge had lost the ability to protect its own people. Elsewhere on campus, Richard Coleman hurried through a side entrance wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. His usual confidence had collapsed into bitterness. Students recorded him openly as he walked past while whispers followed him through the hallway. Racist, coward, fraud. Coleman stopped briefly when a student yelled, "Say something about diversity now." Laughter erupted nearby. Coleman's jaw tightened, but he kept walking without answering. Minutes later, Harbridge officially announced his suspension pending investigation. The reaction online was immediate, but the scandal only kept growing. By afternoon, several students involved in the original humiliation video, including Tyler Monroe, received expulsion notices after footage surfaced proving deliberate harassment toward Evelyn Carter. Tyler stormed out of the disciplinary office pale with rage. His father had already called 3 attorneys, but for once, family money could not stop public humiliation. Cameras waited outside the building. Students filmed him leaving. The same internet that once laughed with him now celebrated watching him fall. Across campus, Naomi Reed sat quietly inside the nearly empty library, trying to process how quickly the university had transformed around her. Students who once ignored her now looked at her differently. Some apologized awkwardly. Others avoided eye contact completely. But the strange thing was this: Naomi still felt uncertain. Pain did not disappear simply because the truth became public. She stared down at her phone where hundreds of comments discussed Evelyn Carter like a legend. Hero, billionaire, secret owner. Yet Naomi could still only picture the quiet woman cleaning library tables late at night. The same woman who spoke gently to her when nobody else cared. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. You okay?" Lucas Miller stood beside the table, holding 2 cups of coffee awkwardly. He looked exhausted too, but calmer than before. Since publicly distancing himself from Tyler's group, Lucas had become one of the few white students openly speaking against Harbridge online, which also made him a target. Anonymous insults flooded his accounts daily. Some students called him a traitor. Others accused him of chasing attention. But Lucas no longer looked interested in protecting popularity. Naomi accepted the coffee quietly. "Thanks." Lucas sat across from her. "The student network invited me onto their live stream tonight," he said carefully. "They want to talk about everything happening." Naomi looked uncertain immediately. "I don't think I should." Lucas shook his head. "That's exactly why you should." That evening, thousands of students tuned into Harbridge Student Broadcasting Network as Lucas Miller appeared live beside Naomi Reed inside a small campus studio. The host, Alicia Perez, introduced them nervously, while social media comments flooded the screen faster than moderators could control them. Alicia was a Latina journalism student with short black curls and sharp, intelligent eyes. Unlike most student reporters, she asked direct questions without trying to soften discomfort. "Why speak publicly now?" she asked Lucas first. Lucas exhaled slowly. "Because silence helped create this place." The room stayed quiet. Lucas continued carefully. "I kept pretending things weren't happening because I didn't want problems. But pretending not to see racism doesn't make someone neutral. It just makes them useful to the people causing it." Clips from the interview spread online almost immediately. Then, Alicia turned toward Naomi. For several seconds, Naomi said nothing. Her hands trembled slightly beneath the table. Millions of people were now watching Harbridge, watching her. Finally, Naomi spoke quietly. "The hardest part wasn't being insulted," she admitted. "It was feeling like everybody around me already decided I deserved it." The studio became completely silent. Naomi swallowed hard before continuing. "When people treat you like you don't belong long enough, eventually you start wondering if they're right." Outside the studio, students gathered around phones listening. Some cried quietly. Others looked ashamed. For the first time since arriving at Harbridge, Naomi was no longer invisible. Meanwhile, Daniel Ross became something unexpected overnight, a national media figure. Television stations invited him onto political panels. Podcasts praised his reporting. Universities contacted him privately asking questions about Harbridge's internal culture. His articles had transformed from local investigation into national conversation. But Daniel barely cared about the attention, because one question still haunted him. Why had Evelyn Carter waited so long? That same night, former Harbridge students across the country finally began speaking publicly too. An older black attorney described being mocked during law seminars 20 years earlier. A former Asian student admitted she stopped speaking in class after repeated humiliation from professors. Another graduate confessed he nearly took his own life during a sophomore year because Harbridge convinced him he was intellectually inferior. The stories never stopped, and each one made the university look worse. Yet through all of it, Evelyn Carter refused every interview request. CNN offered exclusive appearances. Major newspapers requested statements. Political commentators begged for conversations. Evelyn declined all of them. She remained almost impossible to find. Students occasionally spotted her walking quietly through campus wearing simple winter coats, still calm despite becoming the center of national attention. Some people expected revenge from her. Others expected destruction. Sell the university, expose more names, burn the institution publicly. Late Friday evening, reporters finally cornered Evelyn outside the administration building while cameras surrounded her beneath falling snow. Mrs. Carter," one reporter shouted, "are you planning to pull Carter Foundation funding from Harbridge?" Another yelled, "Will you resign from the board? Do you believe the university deserves to survive this scandal?" Cameras flashed endlessly against the dark winter sky. For a moment, Evelyn simply looked at the historic stone buildings surrounding the campus. The same buildings where students had suffered quietly for decades. The same buildings carrying her family's name in hidden places, nobody noticed. Then she answered softly, "No." The crowd fell silent instantly. Evelyn looked directly toward the cameras. "This school," she said calmly, "will become what it always pretended to be." And for the first time since the scandal began, people realized Evelyn Carter had never come to destroy Harbridge. She had come to force it to change. The woman who changed Harbridge. Spring arrived slowly in Boston after one of the harshest winters the city had seen in years. Snow finally disappeared from the stone pathways of Harbridge University, replaced by damp grass, pale sunlight, and the sound of construction crews renovating parts of the old campus. The air itself felt different now. Not lighter exactly, but more honest. 3 months after the scandal broke, Harbridge University still carried scars. Lawsuits remained ongoing. Several professors had quietly resigned. Applications from wealthy legacy families had dropped sharply. But for the first time in decades, students across campus openly discussed things that once survived only in whispers. And somehow, despite everything, Harbridge had not collapsed. It had changed. Not perfectly, but undeniably, new signs appeared throughout campus beside classrooms and residence halls. Discrimination, reporting office, student equity center, confidential support services. Some students mocked the reforms privately, calling them public relations theater. Others called them overdue. But students who once felt invisible now walked through campus knowing at least someone would finally listen if they spoke. At the center of nearly all those reforms stood one name, Evelyn Carter. The Carter Scholarship Program officially launched in early March with full funding guarantees for students facing discrimination, financial hardship, or retaliation tied to racial bias complaints. Hundreds of applications arrived within days. Alongside it, Evelyn established the Carter Equity Center inside the old Humanities building near the center courtyard. The center provided legal support, counseling services, tutoring programs, and independent oversight for discrimination cases. More importantly, it operated separately from Harbridge administration entirely, which meant complaints could no longer quietly disappear. The person selected to help publicly represent the new academic initiative surprised almost nobody. Naomi Reed. On a windy Thursday afternoon, Naomi stood nervously inside a photography studio while university staff prepared promotional material for the Carter Scholarship Program. Large lights reflected against white backdrops while assistants adjusted camera angles around her. Naomi still looked uncomfortable being the center of attention. Though her confidence had grown over recent months, part of her remained the quiet girl who once sat alone in lecture halls, wondering if she truly belonged there. But something inside her had changed too. Strength now lived where fear once sat. She wore a dark blue blazer over a cream-colored sweater, her natural curls pulled neatly behind her shoulders while a university photographer adjusted focus nearby. "Relax a little," the photographer said kindly. His name was Marcus Hale, a middle-aged black photographer hired by the Carter Foundation to document the university reforms. Marcus had broad shoulders, warm brown eyes, and a calm, patient demeanor shaped by years photographing difficult social movements across the country. Unlike most media staff Naomi had met recently, Marcus spoke to people gently instead of treating them like headlines. "You look like you're preparing for cross-examination," he joked softly. Naomi laughed quietly for the first time all morning. Across the room, Lucas Miller sat waiting beside equipment cases while reviewing student outreach schedules on his laptop. Over the past few months, Lucas and Naomi had become unexpectedly close friends, not through dramatic conversations or forced apologies, but through shared exhaustion. Both of them understood now how lonely it felt standing against a system larger than yourself. Lucas looked different too, less polished, less desperate to impress people. After losing most of his wealthy social circle, he had stopped pretending to be someone else entirely. He now spent most of his free time helping organize peer mentoring programs connected to the Equity Center. Some students still hated him for publicly speaking out. Lucas no longer cared much. "You ready for the speech tomorrow?" he asked Naomi. Naomi groaned softly. "No." You'll survive. That's easy for you to say. Lucas smiled faintly. You survived Richard Coleman. A microphone should be easier. Naomi rolled her eyes, but the smile that followed came naturally now. Outside the studio windows, students crossed campus beneath blooming trees where snowbanks once stood. Harbridge still looked prestigious, still looked elite, but the atmosphere had shifted subtly. Students no longer laughed openly when janitors cleaned hallways. Professors spoke more carefully during lectures, and every person on campus knew exactly who Evelyn Carter was. Ironically, that knowledge changed the university faster than policies ever could. Weeks later, during a university-wide assembly introducing the Carter equity reforms formally, Naomi stood on stage before thousands of students gathered inside Harbridge's historic auditorium, the same auditorium where she once felt too intimidated to even raise her hand. Now, she stood beneath bright lights holding prepared notes in trembling fingers. Rows of students watched silently. Faculty members sat near the back. Reporters filled several aisles. Naomi inhaled slowly before speaking. When I first came to Harbridge, she began quietly, I spent most of my time trying not to be noticed. The room remained completely silent. Naomi looked across the audience. I thought surviving meant staying quiet enough to avoid becoming a target. Several students lowered their eyes. But silence doesn't protect people forever, she continued. Sometimes it only protects the people causing harm. The applause afterward lasted nearly 30 seconds. Near the back row, Evelyn Carter watched quietly without drawing attention to herself. She still disliked public recognition. Even after becoming nationally famous, Evelyn avoided most ceremonies whenever possible. She attended meetings, approved reforms, funded programs, and disappeared again quietly afterward. Many students expected someone wealthier looking, more intimidating. Instead, they often saw an elderly black woman carrying old books through campus alone or drinking tea quietly beside library windows. And somehow, that simplicity made her more respected, not less. Meanwhile, Daniel Ross's investigation eventually earned National Journalism Awards, though Daniel himself remained uncomfortable with celebrity attention. He continued publishing stories exposing systemic discrimination at elite institutions beyond Harbridge, turning the scandal into part of a larger national conversation. But privately, Daniel often admitted Harbridge changed him too, because for the first time in his career, he watched a powerful person use power to repair something instead of protecting themselves. By late April, construction finished on the new Carter Equity Center entrance. Students gathered outside during the dedication ceremony while sunlight reflected against freshly restored stone walls. Evelyn arrived quietly, wearing a simple charcoal coat instead of formal designer clothing, despite repeated requests from university staff. She refused security escorts, too. I walk these halls alone for 6 months, she told administrators calmly. I think I'll survive one more afternoon. People laughed softly, but nobody missed the deeper meaning behind the sentence. After the ceremony ended and crowds slowly disappeared into the warm spring evening, Harbridge finally grew quiet again. The next morning, before sunrise, Naomi arrived early at the law building to prepare for exams. Dew covered the grass outside while pale golden light slipped through stained glass windows into the empty hallway. And there, near the staircase beside the old lecture rooms, she saw Evelyn Carter again, wearing the gray janitor uniform, holding a mop, quietly cleaning the hallway floor. Naomi stopped walking immediately. For a moment, she simply stared in disbelief. "Hi, Mrs. Carter," she said softly. Evelyn looked up with a small smile. "You're awake early." Naomi stepped closer slowly. "You don't need to do this anymore." The hallway remained silent except for distant birds outside the windows. Evelyn rested both hands lightly on the mop handle. Then she smiled again, gently this time. "If power only listens when wealthy people speak," she said quietly, "then I needed to hear the truth quietly first." Naomi felt emotion tighten painfully in her chest. She looked around the hallway that once held laughter, humiliation, and silence. Now, students walking past slowed instinctively when they saw Evelyn. Not because they feared her, because they finally understood who she truly was. An elderly black woman who spent 6 months quietly cleaning hallways while the university revealed its ugliest truths around her. And the same woman who forced one of America's most prestigious institutions to finally confront itself. Evelyn dipped the mop back into the water bucket calmly, then continued cleaning the floor as morning sunlight slowly filled the halls of Harbridge University. At the end of this story, the biggest lesson was never really about money, power, or who owned the university. It was about how easily people can become cruel when they believe someone is powerless. In everyday life, many people are treated exactly like Evelyn was. Quiet people, elderly people, workers we pass every day without noticing, students who sit alone, people carrying pain silently while the world keeps moving around them. This story reminds us that respect should never depend on status, race, appearance, or wealth. A person's value does not change because society chooses not to see it. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who stay kind even after being humiliated. And sometimes the people we overlook are carrying more wisdom, dignity, and strength than anyone in the room. Harbridge changed because the truth was finally exposed. But in real life, many people still suffer quietly because nobody speaks up. That is why silence matters. The jokes we ignore matter. The unfair treatment we excuse matters. Every small act of disrespect helps build a world where cruelty feels normal. So before you laugh at someone, pause. Before you judge someone, look again. And before you stay silent while another person is humiliated, remember that your silence may become part of their pain. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs this message today. Leave a comment and tell us what part of the story affected you the most. And if you believe kindness, justice, and compassion still matter in this world, please subscribe to the channel and support more stories like this. May God bless every person watching this video. May He protect those who feel unseen, give strength to those fighting silent battles, and soften the hearts of people who have forgotten how powerful simple kindness can be. And if you believe no human being should ever be treated as less than another, comment Amen below.